last week, the Australian National University released their findings on their inaugural poll of public opinion toward governance. This really caught my attention because it demonstrated that opinion in Australia is much different and much more positive than in the rest of the developed world. 73% of Australians are satisfied, or very satisfied, in the direction this country is headed. Only 20% are not satisfied, and 7% haven't made up their mind. I'd like to talk to some of those. What's their problem? But this is the polar opposite of what you find in both the U.S. and Great Britain. Only 22% of Americans are satisfied with the direction the U.S. is taking, and they didn't even poll Bush on that one, so maybe a little more. And in the UK, only 25% of the Brits are pleased with the direction they are headed. So things here are quite different from the way they are in the rest of the developed world. These kinds of nationwide polls, however, can often mask differences among regions or between rural and urban, especially since the respondents in this country and in many other countries of the world are dominated by people who live in urban areas. So I think that there's always a problem, and it's a problem I faced all the time in the job I had in the United States and in the Western U.S., and that is you can't get people who live in the cities and in the urbanized parts of the country to really understand what the issues are in the regional and rural areas of the country. One of the things we did is we were having problems because we had boom towns in the West where I was head of these I had this think tank and was head of the Western governors like the premiers at a time when we had the energy boom in the Western U.S. And people in Congress, the staffers and others didn't understand. They all came from Philadelphia. They all came from New York, and they came from places where you could graze 40 cows to an acre, not 40 acres to a cow, the way it was out west. So one of the things we did is we brought them all out, put them on a 737, took them around and let them see what it was like to live in these areas with 5,000 people or 2,500 people, or see a town that has 30,000 people in it that 3 years before only had 2,500 people in it, and the kinds of issues they had to deal with. Or to see towns that 3 years before had 2,500 people and today has 1,900 people because it's stagnating and declining. So Australia has these same kinds of issues that we face all over the world in large countries that have both urban and rural areas. And the problem is that in a democracy where numbers count, the urban areas dominate. They always do. Urban concerns dominate. They always do. And unless you have some way to bring to the attention of the entire electorate the synergies that have to exist between urban and rural areas, synergies, by the way, that economists have long recognized. I mean, Jane Jacobs has written some wonderful books about the inextricable link that exists between the cities and the hinterland. She calls it the hinterland. And how these two reinforce each other. Well, I'll tell you, you go to Washington, D.C. or to Canberra, you have a hard time finding very many people, who have that synergistic view of the relationship between an urban area and a rural area. You have your urban advocates, you have your rural advocates, but you have very few advocates on the synergism that exists between the two. And that's really, I think what we have to, come to grips with. But what about the boom towns? What about the rapidly growing communities in rural Australia that are having problems coping with explosive growth? What about the communities that aren't booming, that are stagnating or declining? What about the drought-stricken farming communities? What about the communities that are losing population to surrounding regional centers or to capital cities? So there's an underlying issue here that I think deserves serious attention, and that's the urban-centric focus of much of what we do, especially the urban-centric focus of many national policies and regulations, and the urban-centric focus, the urban-centric views that dominate national media. Consider the urban-centric bias of the experts at the ACCC who set prices for telecommunication services. Nearly everyone in Australia embraces the idea of national uniform prices, the idea that people in the bush should pay roughly the same as people in the cities for telecommunication services. Now, We don't feel that way about cars. People, automobiles, people in the bush pay more for automobiles than people in the cities. People in the cities get better deals because of the volumes that are moved. We don't feel that way about housing. People in the rural areas have a lot cheaper housing than people in Melbourne or Sydney, but we don't talk about equal prices there. But in Australia, in the United States, in Great Britain, in almost every country in Europe, there is a widespread social consensus that telecommunications services ought to be the same for people in rural and urban areas. Everybody ought to pay the same for this lifeline to the outside world. But the policy of national uniform prices is not the view of the ACCC. In their wisdom, the appointed officials and experts of the ACCC have decided that people in the bush should pay more for telecom than people in the cities. A lot more. The ACCC experts call this de-averaged prices. It sounds innocent enough until you find out what it really means. The current prices set by the ACCC look like this. If you live in the central business district, it's $6.40 a month that the wholesale providers can buy it for. If it's in the inner suburbs, it's $15.20 a month. If it's the outer suburbs, it's $30.20 a month. If it's in regional, rural, remote Australia, well, they don't even give a price for that. And when you ask them why, they say, well, no competitors will want to be out there. Because why? Because if you reverse engineer their pricing, it'd be somewhere between $150 and $180 a month. And then people say, why is there no competition in the bush on landlines? Well, the fact is there's a lot of competition in the bush. I'm going to show you in just a second. It's not just landlines, it's landlines, satellites, wireless, and so on. But the fact is they have priced telecommunications services in a way that is contrary to every major national policy. So I think that, and also I might say to the general public opinion in this country, in the Australian Financial Review, if you look on the slide over here, we have the Australian saying about in June 2007, amid all the claims of revolution, the high-speed internet age realistically means more movie and song downloads. And that's been kind of a motif of the Australian, one of our national newspapers, that the only thing broadband is really good for is movies, music, and porn. That's another one they added in some of it. The second one is that from the Australian Financial Review, though industries are clamoring for subsidized fiber, I don't know any industries clamoring for subsidized fiber to start with, but assume the premise is true. It's not clear that fiber is an economic imperative. Now, I don't know anybody in the world who doesn't believe that broadband doesn't improve productivity.